The shovel bit into the earth with a sound like a heavy sigh. Elias felt the familiar shudder travel up the ash handle, through his palms and into the bones of his arms. He shifted his weight, bent his knees, and levered the load of dark, damp soil. It was the 217th shovelful of the morning. He knew because he counted. Counting was a way to measure the work, to make the impossible task feel like a series of small, possible ones. The soil arced through the cool autumn air and landed with a soft thud on the growing mound beside the excavation. Beside him, Boro, a dog whose lineage was a mix of shepherd and shadow, lifted his head. His intelligent brown eyes watched the dirt fly. Then he rested his chin back on his paws, a silent, furry witness to the slow hollowing of the world. The hole was now 10 feet across and nearly 5 feet deep. It was a perfect circle, its edges scribed with a stake and a length of rope. To anyone walking the ridge path, it would have looked like the beginning of a well, or perhaps a root cellar. But it was in the wrong place for a cellar, too far from the small cabin his grandfather had built, and too wide for a well. It was an anomaly, a wound in the earth that invited questions. The first question came in the form of Mr. Gable, his nearest neighbor a half-mile down the valley. Gable was a man carved from the same tough timber as the fences on his land, his face a roadmap of hard winters and disappointing harvests. He stopped his mule at the edge of the clearing, his eyes narrowing at the boy in the hole. "What in God's name are you doing, Elias?" he called out, his voice raspy with suspicion. "You planning on burying a horse?" Elias planted the shovel in the ground and wiped a sleeve across his brow, leaving a streak of mud. He looked at the older man, his expression unreadable. "Building," he said. The word was quiet, simple. Gable snorted, a dry, dismissive sound. "Building what? Your own grave? That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. A boy digging a hole in the middle of nowhere. Your grandfather left you a perfectly good cabin. You'd do better to patch the roof before the snow flies than to be playing in the dirt." He shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. "Wait until winter. You'll see." Elias offered no argument. He simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head that acknowledged the words without accepting their judgment. He had heard the phrase, "wait until winter," his entire life. It was the local mantra, a warning, a threat, a promise of nature's final, coldest say in all human endeavors. He picked up the shovel again. It was time for the 218th scoop. Mr. Gable watched for another moment, then clicked his tongue and urged his mule onward, the picture of conventional wisdom leaving folly behind. Boro watched him go, a low rumble in his chest that wasn't quite a growl. That evening, the air grew teeth. A chill seeped from the darkening woods, and the first frost laid a silver blanket over the discarded earth. Inside the small cabin, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Elias sat at the rough-hewn table, a bowl of stew steaming before him. Boro lay at his feet, gnawing on a bone. Propped against the salt crock was his grandfather's journal. The leather was cracked and worn smooth by years of handling. The pages were filled with a spidery, precise script, interspersed with detailed drawings and mathematical calculations. It was not a diary of feelings, but a logbook of observations. Decades of watching the world, not as a poet, but as an engineer of the earth. There were temperature charts, soil composition analyses, and studies of how the groundhogs dug their burrows. His grandfather had been a quiet man, much like Elias, and had been considered just as strange. He had spent more time studying anthills than talking to people. Elias turned to a heavily marked page. A cross-section of a dome was sketched with charcoal. Arrows indicated the flow of air. Notes filled the margins. "The earth breathes," his grandfather had written. "It holds the summer's warmth deep in its belly. A structure built within it, not upon it, does not fight the winter. It merely sleeps through it." Below, a calculation. A wall of packed clay 3 feet thick will maintain a temperature differential of 60 degrees. The frost line is at 4 feet. Below that, the earth is a constant 55 degrees. Elias traced the drawing of a ventilation shaft, a clever design that used convection to pull fresh air in and stale air out without creating a draft. He had read these pages 100 times since his grandfather had passed 2 years prior, leaving him the cabin, the land, and the books. The words were a legacy, a map left by the only person who had ever understood the quiet hum of the world in the same way he did. He had spent 2 years gathering supplies, planning, and waiting for the conviction to settle in his bones. Now, it was as solid as the bedrock deep beneath his feet. He had a plan. The next day, he hit the clay layer. The soil changed from dark loam to a heavy, rust-colored stickiness. The digging became harder, the shovel making a sucking sound with each pull. This was what the journals had promised, the heart of the project. He spent a week just excavating the clay, piling it separately from the topsoil. His hands, already calloused, began to crack and bleed. He would clean them at night with tallow and herbs, his movements slow and deliberate, just as he did everything. Mrs. Gable came by next, bringing a loaf of bread wrapped in a checkered cloth. She was a kind woman, but her kindness was laced with a nervous anxiety. She looked at Elias's raw hands and the deepening pit with undisguised alarm. "Elias, child, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Gable told me, but I didn't believe him. You'll catch your death of cold out here. This isn't right. A boy your age should be thinking about the future, not digging holes." "This is for the future," Elias said, his voice soft. He accepted the bread with a grateful nod. "But what is it?" she pressed. "A shelter." "A shelter from what? The cabin is strong." "A shelter from the cold," he replied, and left it at that. He did not mention the other passages in the journal, the ones that spoke of the changing weather patterns his grandfather had observed over 50 years. The winters were getting colder, the storms more violent. The blizzards that once came every decade now came every few years, each one worse than the last. The old ways of surviving, his grandfather had written, would soon not be enough. Mrs. Gable left the bread and walked away, her shoulders slumped with worry. She had tried. She would tell the others in the village that she had tried. The boy was stubborn. He had his grandfather's strangeness in him. The first wooden forms went up in the 3rd week. Elias used timber he had cut and cured himself the previous year. He was building the entryway first, a long, sloping tunnel that would face south. It would have a heavy outer door and a lighter inner door, creating an airlock. The journals called it a sun trap. The low winter sun would shine directly down the passage, heating the air and the packed earth floor. He began to process the clay. He built a shallow mixing pit, hauling water from the creek in 2 5-gallon buckets, his shoulders straining under the yoke. He mixed the clay, water, and chopped straw with his bare feet, the cold mud squelching between his toes. It was grueling, repetitive work. For days, the only sounds were the squish of the mud, his own steady breathing, and the occasional sigh from Boro, who watched the whole process from a dry patch of grass, his head cocked in endless curiosity. Anya found him like this, covered in red mud up to his knees, his face streaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. She was the miller's daughter, with eyes the color of the summer sky and a way of moving that was both graceful and practical. She did not laugh or look away in confusion. She watched, her expression one of genuine interest. "My father says you're trying to dig to China," she said, her voice clear and without a hint of mockery. She held out a small pail. "Mother sent some buttermilk." Elias stepped out of the pit, his feet making sticky tracks on the grass. "Thank you." He took the pail, his muddy hands leaving prints on the clean metal. He drank deeply, the cool, tangy liquid a balm to his parched throat. "What is the straw for?" Anya asked, gesturing to the mixing pit. "It's a binder," Elias explained, finding it easier to talk to her than to anyone else. "It holds the clay together when it dries, prevents cracking, like sinew in a muscle." She nodded, considering this. "And the walls will be made of this?" "Yes, packed earth, 3 feet thick." "Why 3 feet?" "For the warmth," he said. "The earth holds it." She looked from the pit to the cabin, then back to him. She didn't offer advice or warnings. She just asked, "Will it be ready before the snow?" "It has to be," Elias said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to anyone all week. The walls began to rise. He built wooden forms, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and packed the damp clay mixture into them with a heavy wooden tamper. He would pack a layer, let it set slightly, then add another. It was a slow, layered process, like building a mountain one handful at a time. Each evening, he would remove the forms from a completed section, revealing a solid, seamless wall of reddish-brown earth. He ran his hands over its cool, smooth surface. It felt alive, ancient. He was not building with dead wood or cold stone. He was sculpting the land itself. Mr. Sterling, the town's wealthiest man and the owner of the lumber mill, rode by on his fine black horse one afternoon. He reined in, looking down his long nose at the half-finished structure, which now resembled a large earthen pot sinking into the ground. "Gable told me you'd lost your senses, boy," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see he wasn't exaggerating. What is this monument to foolishness going to cost you?" "Just my time," Elias replied, not pausing in his work of tamping the clay. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythm was its own answer. "Time is money," Sterling scoffed, "and you're wasting both. When that hovel of yours collapses in the first big thaw and you come to my mill begging for lumber to rebuild your grandfather's cabin properly, the price will have gone up. Remember that." He spurred his horse and rode off, leaving the scent of expensive leather and self-satisfaction in the air. Elias kept tamping. Thump, thump, thump. By the first week of November, the walls were complete, forming a circular room 18 feet in diameter. Now came the most difficult part, the roof. The journal showed a design for a self-supporting dome, a complex structure of interlocking wooden beams that would serve as a frame for the packed earth. It required precise angles and careful joinery. He spent a week in the cabin at night, working by lantern light, cutting the beams and notches with his grandfather's old tools. His hands knew the feel of the wood, the way the saw sang through pine, the satisfying chunk of a chisel seating a joint. He built the dome's frame on the ground first, a skeleton of wood that looked like a giant spiderweb. With a system of ropes and levers, and with every ounce of strength he and Boro possessed, the dog pulling on a rope, digging his paws in for traction, he raised the frame into place atop the walls. It was the most perilous moment of the entire construction. For a long, heart-stopping minute, the structure swayed, groaning under its own weight. Then it settled, the joints holding firm. Elias stood back, breathing heavily, a deep sense of relief washing over him. The bones were in place. Now he just had to give it skin. Applying the clay to the domed roof was a slow, precarious process. He worked from a ladder, packing the mud and straw mixture over the wooden frame, smoothing it with a trowel. He worked from the bottom up, spiraling toward the center, where he left an opening for a small, thick-paned skylight and the metal chimney for the small iron stove he would install inside. He coated the entire exterior with a mixture of beeswax and linseed oil, a waterproofing technique detailed in the journal. The final structure looked less like a building and more like a natural feature of the landscape, a smooth, grassy hillock that had risen from the earth. The only signs of its true nature were the sturdy wooden door at the end of the sunken entryway and the thin metal pipe of the chimney poking out of the top. He finished the day the first snowflakes began to fall. They were fat, wet flakes that melted on the packed earth, but they were a promise of what was to come, a harbinger. Elias stood with Boro at his side, his work finally done. He had moved over 60 tons of earth by hand. He had mixed and packed 20 tons of clay. His back ached with a deep, permanent fire, and his hands were maps of scars and calluses. But as he looked at the gentle mound, he felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. He had not built a thing, he had listened to a thing. He had translated his grandfather's wisdom from paper and ink into earth and wood. He spent the next 2 weeks stocking his creation. He moved half his winter supply of firewood inside, stacking it neatly along one curved wall. He brought in sacks of potatoes, onions, dried beans, and salted meat. He installed the small cast-iron stove, carefully fitting the pipe through the roof. He furnished the space simply: a cot, a small table, a chair, and a shelf for his grandfather's journals. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth, straw, and pine. It was the smell of safety. The snows came and went. The village settled into the rhythms of winter. The mockery Elias had endured faded to a kind of pitying silence. The boy in the mud hut was an object lesson, a cautionary tale whispered over firesides. He was seen in the village only occasionally, a quiet figure buying a few supplies, his dog always at his heels. He answered questions about his well-being with a simple, "I'm fine." Anya was the only one who visited. She brought him a knitted scarf of a deep blue color and stood inside the shelter, her breath misting in the cool air. "It's quiet in here," she said, her voice soft. The sounds of the outside world were muted, distant. Elias lit the small stove. The kindling caught quickly, and a small flame began to lick at the seasoned oak. Within minutes, a gentle warmth began to radiate from the iron, a warmth that didn't flee up to the ceiling, but seemed to be absorbed and held by the thick earthen walls. "The walls hold the heat," he said. He hung a thermometer, a precious instrument his grandfather had owned, on a wooden peg. It read 48 degrees. He gestured for her to wait. They sat in silence, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, a bitter wind began to howl, rattling the bare branches of the trees. Inside, the world was still. After an hour, Elias pointed to the thermometer. It read 70 degrees. The stove was barely working, consuming a tiny amount of wood, yet the space was profoundly, comfortably warm. Anya looked at the thermometer, then at the thick walls, then at Elias. A slow smile spread across her face. "It works," she whispered. "It works," he agreed. The great blizzard began on the 3rd Tuesday of January. It did not arrive with the dramatic fury of a summer storm, but with a quiet, ominous thickening of the sky. The world turned a uniform, pearlescent gray. The air grew heavy and still, a held breath before a scream. Mr. Gable, passing Elias's cabin on his way back from town, shouted over the rising wind, "Batten your hatches, boy. The old-timers say this is going to be a bad one. Hope your mud pie doesn't melt." Elias just nodded and gave Boro a reassuring pat. He had checked the barometer that morning. The needle had fallen lower than he had ever seen it. He had already moved the last of his essential supplies and himself and Boro into the shelter. He'd secured the cabin as best he could, but his trust was not in the house of wood. It was in the house of earth. He shut the heavy inner door of the sun trap, then the even heavier outer door, plunging the entryway into darkness. He lit a single lantern in the main chamber. The world outside vanished. The wind, which had begun to shriek, was now only a low, muffled moan, the sound of a distant sea. He stoked the fire in the small stove, adding a single seasoned log. Boro, who was usually restless in storms, curled up on a sheepskin rug and fell into a deep, untroubled sleep. Elias sat at his small table, listening. He could feel the storm more than he could hear it. A deep, resonant vibration in the ground, a pressure against the dome of his shelter. He was not on the earth, battling the elements. He was in the earth, insulated from them. A seed, dormant and safe, waiting for spring. He checked the thermometer. 71 degrees. He took off his heavy wool sweater. He opened one of his grandfather's journals and began to read by the steady, unwavering light of the lantern. For 3 days, the world ceased to exist. The snow fell in a solid, blinding curtain, driven by a wind that scoured the landscape. It was a storm that people would later call the White Death. It buried fences, collapsed barns, and froze livestock solid in the fields. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, with a wind chill that could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. In the village, houses groaned under the weight of the snow. Chimneys clogged, and fires went out. The cold, an insidious predator, began to seep through every crack and crevice. Inside the earthen dome, life continued in a bubble of warmth and tranquility. The air was fresh, thanks to the ingenious ventilation shafts that drew air down one side, warmed it as it passed under the floor near the stove, and exhaled it through the chimney flue. Elias ate his simple meals, read, and slept. The stove required only a few logs a day to maintain the steady, comfortable warmth. The silence was the most remarkable thing. It was a profound, peaceful quiet that seemed to soak into his very bones. Outside, a war was being waged against the world. Inside, there was only peace. On the morning of the 4th day, a new sound broke the stillness. It was a frantic, muffled pounding. Boro's head shot up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Elias quieted him with a hand. The sound was coming from the outer door. It was desperate. Elias made his way through the sun-trap tunnel. Unlatching the heavy outer door was a struggle. A wall of snow had drifted against it, solid as packed ice. He had to put his shoulder into it, pushing with all his might. It finally gave way with a groan, revealing a narrow canyon he had carved in a world of white. And in that canyon stood a figure, a ghost caked in snow, his face rimmed with ice. It was Mr. Gable. His eyes were wild with fear and exhaustion. "Elias," he croaked, his voice a raw whisper. "For the love of God, help us." Behind him, huddled and shivering, was his wife, her face pale and drawn. Elias said nothing. He simply stood back, holding the door open. They stumbled past him into the tunnel. When they entered the main chamber, they both stopped, stunned into silence. They stared, uncomprehending, at the scene before them. The gentle lantern light, the quiet warmth that wrapped around them like a blanket. Elias, standing there in his shirt sleeves, Boro, thumping his tail in a cautious welcome. It's warm," Mrs. Gable stammered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The roof," Gable managed to say, his body shaking uncontrollably. "The weight of the snow. It came down. The whole north side of the house. We barely got out." Elias gestured to the sheepskin rug near the stove. "Sit. Get warm." He ladled hot broth from a pot on the stove into 2 mugs and handed them to the shivering couple. They drank it greedily, their hands shaking so badly they could barely hold the mugs. For a long time, the only sounds were their chattering teeth and the soft crackle of the fire. An hour later, there was more pounding. This time it was the Sterling family. Their grand house on the hill, with its large, drafty windows and inefficient furnace, had turned into an icebox. The furnace had failed, the pipes had frozen and burst, and they had fled with their 2 young children wrapped in every blanket they owned. Mr. Sterling, the man who had mocked Elias's monument to foolishness, stood in the entryway, his pride stripped away by the brutal cold, his face a mask of humbled desperation. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible. "My children." Again, Elias simply stepped aside. By nightfall, the shelter was full. 12 people, the Gables, the Sterlings, the widow Maeve and her son, old Thomas from the end of the lane, were huddled in the gentle 70-degree warmth of the earthen dome. They were a cross-section of the community, a gathering of the very people who had pitied and scorned him. Now they were his guests, their lives dependent on the structure they had so easily dismissed. They sat in a stunned, grateful silence. They looked at the smooth, curved walls, the clever ventilation, the sheer, impossible comfort of the place. They were inside the belly of the earth, and it was the safest place in the world. Mr. Sterling, a man used to commanding every room he entered, sat on an overturned bucket, his daughter asleep in his arms, and simply stared at the wall. He was not looking at a wall of mud and straw. He was looking at the face of a wisdom he had never known existed. Elias moved among them, quietly offering food and blankets, a silent host in his unlikely sanctuary. He was no longer the strange boy, the fool digging a hole. He was their savior. The storm broke on the 5th day. A brilliant, painful sun shone on a world transformed, a landscape buried under 10 feet of silent, white devastation. The village was shattered. Roofs had collapsed. Houses were filled with snow. The community's winter stores were ruined, but they were alive, all of them. As they emerged from the shelter, blinking in the bright light, they saw the truth. The sturdy, conventional wooden structures had failed. The simple, unconventional earthen mound stood unscathed, a small wisp of smoke curling from its chimney, an emblem of quiet, unshakable strength. A few days later, after the initial shock had passed and the hard work of digging out had begun, Mr. Gable approached Elias. The older man's face was etched with a new humility. He stood for a moment, twisting his cap in his hands, unable to meet the boy's eyes. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I said, I was a fool. You saved us, Elias. My wife and we'd have frozen to death. You saved all of us." He looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's. "How? How did you know?" For an answer, Elias went inside the shelter and returned with one of his grandfather's journals. He opened it to the page with the drawing of the dome, the calculations, the notes about the Earth's constant temperature. He handed it to Gable. The farmer took the book with a reverence usually reserved for a Bible. He traced the drawings with a calloused finger, his lips moving as he slowly read the spidery script. He saw the decades of observation, the patient accumulation of knowledge. It wasn't madness. It was science. It was wisdom. "My grandfather listened," Elias said quietly. That spring, the village did not just rebuild. It reimagined. The first person to come to Elias for help was Mr. Gable. "Will you teach me?" he asked, holding the journal. "Will you teach us?" Elias nodded. That summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of digging. Elias, no longer a solitary figure, moved from site to site, teaching, advising, sharing the knowledge his grandfather had so painstakingly gathered. He showed them how to test the clay, how to mix the straw, how to build the forms and tamp the earth. He taught them the geometry of the dome, the principles of the sun trap, the importance of the ventilation. Mr. Sterling, having lost his fortune but gained a measure of wisdom, provided the tools and supplies, his payment a humble request to be taught as well. Anya worked alongside Elias, her quick mind and steady hands making her an invaluable partner. They worked together, a community reborn from the shared experience of a terrible storm and the quiet wisdom of a single book. Years passed. The landscape of the valley changed. The sharp, angular lines of wooden cabins were softened by the gentle, grassy mounds of the earthen shelters that now dotted the hillsides. The village became known for its resilience. When the hard winters came, as they always did, the people no longer feared them. They retreated into the warmth of the earth, secure in the knowledge they had learned. Elias and Anya married and raised a family in a larger, more elaborate version of the original shelter, one with multiple rooms connected by arched tunnels. He never became a loud man, never a leader in the traditional sense. He remained a quiet teacher, a keeper of the knowledge. His authority came not from words, but from the simple, undeniable truth of the shelters that kept his community safe. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slower. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves were turning gold and red, he lay down in his favorite spot of sun on the grassy dome of the first shelter and went to sleep. He did not wake up. Elias buried him on the crest of the hill, beneath a tall pine tree that overlooked the valley of mounds. He carved a simple stone for him. Boro. He was a good witness. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the cold stone, the silence next to him deeper than it had ever been before. More years passed. Elias's hair turned the color of winter snow. His grandchildren would sit at his feet by the fire, their eyes wide as he showed them the now tattered journals of their great-great-grandfather. He would let them trace the drawings, and he would explain in his quiet voice how the earth holds the sun's heat, how a dome is the strongest shape, how patience is the most important tool a builder can have. He was passing the legacy on, just as it had been passed to him. When his own time came, it was as peaceful as Boro's. He died in his sleep, in the warm, quiet dark of the home he had built with his own hands. The entire valley mourned him. They buried him on the hill next to his faithful dog. They placed a large, flat stone over his grave, and Mr. Gable's grandson, a skilled stonemason, carved an epitaph into it. It did not list his accomplishments or the dates of his life. It said simply, "Elias, he taught us to listen." A century later, another great blizzard, a storm that would be spoken of for generations, swept across the land. It raged for a week, burying the world in a deep, white silence. But in the valley, life went on. From the air, the only sign of human existence was the gentle curve of dozens of snow-covered mounds, each with a thin, steady wisp of smoke rising from its chimney, a quiet testament to the boy who had listened to the earth, and in doing so, had saved them all. The original shelter, the one built by a stubborn boy and his dog, still stood, its grassy dome a permanent feature of the landscape, a silent, enduring monument to a different kind of strength.